A millionaire abused his wife and children so much that they ran away. When they met again many years later, he brought them a surprise in the mailbox. The grandfather clock in the parlor struck 8, its resonant chime slicing through the carefully maintained quiet of the Fontaine estate. Valerie sat at the grand piano, her fingers hovering over the polished ivory keys, their brilliance reflecting the flicker of a nearby candelabra. She could feel her mother's gaze on her, sharp as the cut of the crystal glasses on the table behind her. "Play something cheerful, darling," Kimberly said, her voice smooth yet unyielding. "Something uplifting for a change." Valerie's fingers froze. Her mother's words hung in the air like a command, not a suggestion. She pressed lightly on the keys, drawing out a soft, hesitant chord, but the music refused to flow. A shadow of frustration crossed Kimberly's face before she turned back to Harold, her husband, who was engrossed in his evening paper. "Honestly, Harold, the girl's moods are becoming quite a distraction," Kimberly said. "Perhaps marriage will steady her." Valerie's hand slipped from the keys, and the faint echo of the unfinished note dissolved into silence. She swallowed hard, glancing toward her father. Harold Fontaine, with his steely grey hair and impeccable three-piece suit, barely acknowledged her existence as he flipped another page. His presence dominated the room, a reminder that nothing escaped his control. Not his business, not his wife, and certainly not his daughter. "Richard called today," Harold said at last, his deep voice cutting through the air like the strike of a gavel. "He's interested. It's a sound match." Valerie's chest tightened, but she didn't move. Her fingers twitched, craving the comfort of the keys. "I've never even met him," she said softly, her voice breaking the careful decorum of the room. Kimberly's head snapped toward her, her expression one of carefully measured surprise. "You'll meet him soon enough," Kimberly replied, her tone as cold as the marble floors beneath their feet. "Richard is exactly the kind of man who understands the importance of alliances. It's not about love, Valerie. It's about ensuring the Fontaine name remains what it has always been, untouchable." Valerie bit her lip and nodded, her protest dying in her throat. She knew better than to argue. The weight of their expectations hung over her like a chandelier, beautiful yet threatening to crush her under its brilliance. Later that evening, Valerie escaped to the terrace. The air outside was crisp, laced with the faint smell of the hydrangeas her mother had ordered, planted in symmetrical rows. Beyond the estate's wrought iron gates, the city hummed with life, distant and unreachable. She leaned against the railing, staring at the horizon, where the skyline blurred into the stars. Her thoughts drifted to the upright piano in her childhood bedroom, the one she had begged Harold to buy when she was 8. The joy she had felt back then, pressing the keys, discovering how the notes danced together, was a distant memory. The grand piano in the parlor was flawless, its sound exquisite, but playing it felt like a performance, a duty, a reminder of who she was expected to be. The door to the terrace creaked open. Kimberly's heels clicked against the tiles, their sharpness a counterpoint to the softer rhythm of the night. "Don't sulk," Kimberly said, joining her. She didn't look at Valerie, instead gazing out at the perfectly manicured gardens below. "You're being given an opportunity most girls would dream of." "I don't want an opportunity," Valerie said quietly, her fingers gripping the cool metal of the railing. "I want to be a pianist," Kimberly interrupted, her voice laced with faint amusement. "A charming hobby, dear, but hardly a life." "It's not a hobby," Valerie said, her voice rising slightly. Kimberly turned to her, eyebrows arched in a way that froze any further argument. "This conversation is over," Kimberly said. "Your father and I expect you to be gracious when you meet Richard. He deserves your respect." Kimberly turned and left, her silhouette disappearing into the warm glow of the house. Valerie remained, her grip on the railing tightening until the cool metal bit into her palms. Her chest heaved as she swallowed back the frustration bubbling inside her. The city lights seemed to mock her, flickering with a freedom she couldn't reach. Her gaze fell to her hands, pale under the moonlight, and she flexed her fingers as if summoning courage from the muscle memory of the piano. But no melody came to her now. Only silence, as oppressive as the walls of the gilded cage she called home. When Valerie returned inside, Harold was waiting for her in the parlor. He stood beside the piano, his expression unreadable, but his stance commanding. In his hand was a folded piece of paper. "You'll meet Richard on Friday," he said, handing it to her. "It's been arranged." Valerie stared at the paper, its edges crisp and sharp. She didn't unfold it, didn't need to. The weight of her parents' decision had already settled in her chest. With a small nod, she took it and retreated to her room, her footsteps muffled against the thick carpet. As she closed the door behind her, she sat at her desk, staring at the sheet music she hadn't touched in weeks. The notes blurred as tears filled her eyes. For the first time, she didn't reach for the piano. Instead, she sat in the silence, her dread sinking into the walls around her. The day Richard arrived, the Fontaine estate was immaculate, its marble floors gleaming under the chandelier, and the air tinged with the faint aroma of lavender from freshly arranged bouquets. Valerie stood at the top of the staircase, her hands gripping the banister as the heavy front doors swung open. Richard entered like he owned the place. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to commanding attention. He slicked back his dark hair, and his tailored suit fit, as if the fabric itself feared to wrinkle. Harold stepped forward, his handshake firm but deferential, a rare gesture from a man who yielded to no one. "Richard," Harold said, his voice warm but measured. "Welcome. Kimberly and I are thrilled to have you here." "An honor, Mr. Fontaine." Richard's smile was precise, wide enough to charm, but restrained, calculated. His gaze flicked up to Valerie, lingering for a fraction longer than necessary. She resisted the urge to look away, her fingers tightening on the banister. "Valerie, come greet our guest," Kimberly called, her voice as polished as the silverware set out for lunch. Valerie descended slowly, her heels clicking against the marble. She experienced the spectacle in its entirety, as if it were a prize being paraded for scrutiny. When she reached the bottom, Richard extended his hand, the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders like a chain. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Valerie," he said, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth. His handshake was firm, almost too firm, as if testing her resolve. She forced a polite smile. "Likewise," she murmured, withdrawing her hand quickly. Lunch was a performance. Richard and Harold discussed business ventures, their words circling like vultures over financial projections and joint opportunities. Kimberly chimed in occasionally, her laughter light and practiced. Valerie, seated across from Richard, focused on her plate, pushing her salad around with her fork. "And Valerie," Richard's voice broke through the din, pulling her gaze up. "What are your interests?" She was surprised by the question. Harold and Kimberly rarely invited her to speak in these settings. She hesitated, her mind racing for an answer that wouldn't invite scorn. "I enjoy music," she said finally, her voice steady despite the undercurrent of nerves. "Music," Richard repeated, tilting his head. His expression betrayed nothing, but there was a flicker of something. Amusement. Before he recovered, there was a flicker of something, disdain, in his expression. "A noble pursuit." "Valerie plays beautifully," Kimberly interjected, her tone a touch too cheerful. Naturally, she recognizes the importance of prioritizing her responsibilities over her hobbies. There it was. Valerie's jaw tightened, but she kept her face neutral. Richard's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he turned back to Harold, seamlessly returning to their conversation. Later, Valerie found herself alone with Richard in the sunroom, the golden afternoon light spilling through the glass walls. Kimberly had orchestrated the moment, excusing herself with a pointed glance at Valerie that left no room for refusal. Richard stood near the windows, his hands clasped behind his back. "You're quiet," he said, not turning around. His reflection in the glass caught her eye, a dark silhouette against the sprawling gardens. "I prefer listening," she replied, keeping her distance. "It's a rare trait these days," he said, his tone unreadable. When he finally faced her, his smile was still intact, but his eyes were calculating, like a predator sizing up prey. "I admire that." She didn't respond, her silence deliberate. Something about his presence made her skin crawl, though she couldn't pinpoint why. His words were pleasant enough, his demeanor respectful, yet the air between them felt charged, oppressive. "You don't seem particularly thrilled about all this," Richard said, stepping closer. His voice dropped slightly, losing its public polish. "The engagement." Valerie blinked, taken aback by his directness. "It's sudden," she said carefully. His smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sudden, perhaps, but advantageous. For both of us. For you, maybe," she muttered under her breath. "What was that?" he asked, his tone sharper now. "Nothing." Valerie straightened, meeting his gaze. Her heart pounded, but she refused to look away. "I understand my family's expectations." "Good," Richard said, his smile returning, though colder now. "It's important to know where your loyalties lie." The formal engagement dinner was an opulent affair, the kind only the Fontaines could host. The dining room glowed with candlelight, the table set with gilded china and crystal glasses. Harold raised a toast, his voice booming with pride as he announced Valerie and Richard's union. Applause erupted, the clinking of glasses filling the air. Valerie sat motionless, her face a mask of composure. She could feel Richard's hand on hers, his grip firm, possessive. The room blurred around her, the weight of the moment pressing down like a vice. As the guests cheered, Valerie's eyes drifted to the grand piano in the corner. It stood silent, its keys untouched. She wondered if she'd ever play again, not for an audience, not for approval, but simply for herself. The thought lingered, bittersweet, as the dinner continued, and her dreams receded further into the shadows. The Fontaine estate had never looked grander. Experts meticulously curated every detail of the wedding, from the cascading floral arrangements lining the marble staircase to the shimmering crystal chandeliers casting golden light on the polished floors. Valerie stood before the mirror in her suite, the weight of her gown pulling at her shoulders. Layers of lace and tulle swirled around her feet, making her feel less like a bride and more like a doll in an ornate display. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and composed. Kimberly adjusted the diamond-studded tiara nestled in Valerie's dark hair, her own face alight with satisfaction. "You look perfect," Kimberly said, her tone clipped as she smoothed an imaginary wrinkle in Valerie's veil. "You look perfect, Valerie. Exactly as it should be." Valerie's throat tightened, but she nodded, murmuring a soft, "Thank you." She glanced at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, the delicate gloves hiding the way her knuckles had gone white. "Remember," Kimberly added, leaning closer, "this isn't just about you. It's about the family, about the legacy." The words clanged in Valerie's ears as Kimberly stepped back, surveying her daughter like a jeweler appraising a gemstone. Harold entered a moment later, his expression approving but brisk. He offered her his arm. "It's time," he said. The ceremony was a spectacle. Rows of ivory chairs stretched under the canopy of an outdoor pavilion filled with society's most influential figures. The air buzzed with hushed conversations and the clinking of glasses as a string quartet played a soft, elegant tune. Every eye turned toward Valerie as she appeared at the top of the aisle, her hand resting lightly on Harold's arm. She descended slowly, her steps measured against the steady rhythm of the music. The scent of fresh roses mingled with the faint saltiness of the ocean breeze. Guests beamed at her, their admiration palpable, yet all she could feel was the weight of their scrutiny. At the altar, Richard stood tall and composed, his expression unreadable. His dark suit, tailored to perfection, perfectly complemented his authority. As Valerie approached, his eyes locked on hers, the intensity in his gaze sending a shiver down her spine. The officiant's voice echoed through the space, reciting words that Valerie barely heard. She focused instead on the faint hum of the ocean in the distance, wishing she could escape into its endless horizon. "Do you, Valerie Fontaine, take Richard Alden as your lawfully wedded husband?" the officiant asked, his voice steady and expectant. Valerie hesitated, the silence stretching just a moment too long. Kimberly's sharp intake of breath was audible from the front row. Valerie forced herself to meet Richard's gaze, his expression cool and waiting. Her heart pounded, the weight of everyone's eyes pressing down on her. "I do," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard's smile was small, but triumphant. When he slipped the ring onto her finger, his touch was firm, possessive, and final. The reception was an opulent affair, the ballroom shimmering with light and laughter. With a practiced smile, Valerie gracefully navigated through the crowd, accepting congratulations and polite compliments. Richard stayed by her side, his hand resting on the small of her back, a subtle yet constant reminder of his presence. "Smile, darling," Richard said quietly as they posed for a photograph. His tone was smooth but edged with authority. "This is your day." Valerie turned her head slightly, offering the camera a faint mechanical smile. It felt hollow, like the champagne she sipped without tasting, like the music that swirled around her but failed to stir her soul. Valerie was astounded by the expansiveness of Richard's home when they arrived that night. Towering columns flanked the grand entryway, its cold marble floors reflecting the glow of gilded sconces. Beautiful in its precision, every detail designed to impress, but cold. The silence was deafening. "Welcome home," Richard said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. Valerie followed him through the house, her footsteps soft against the polished floors. He led her to a room at the end of a long hallway. The door creaked open, revealing a suite as lavish as the rest of the house. The bed was large and imposing, draped in silk and gold embroidery. "I'll let you settle in," Richard said, his tone clipped. His gaze lingered on her for a moment before he turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him. Alone, Valerie stood in the center of the room, her gown heavy against her frame. She reached up to remove the tiara, placing it carefully on the vanity. Her reflection stared back at her, the diamond necklace at her throat gleaming against her pale skin. Her eyes drifted to the piano in the corner of the room. Its sleek black surface shone in the low light, untouched and pristine. She moved toward it, her fingers brushing the cool keys. No sound came. Valerie pulled her hand away and sat silently, the emptiness of the house enveloping her like a shroud. For the first time, she realized that the gilded cage had simply shifted, its walls larger, colder, and infinitely more isolating. Days in Richard's home began early. The morning sun filtered through the tall, arched windows, illuminating the marble floors and casting long, sharp shadows. Valerie moved through the space as though on a stage, careful and composed. Every movement felt rehearsed, every word measured. Richard's routines dictated hers. Richard served breakfast promptly at 8, leaving the dining room silent except for the faint clink of cutlery. He read the financial pages while she sipped tea, her gaze wandering to the large window overlooking the manicured garden. It was beautiful, but eerily still, like everything else in the house. "You'll meet the estate manager today," Richard said one morning, not looking up from his paper. "She'll brief you on your responsibilities." "My responsibilities?" Valerie asked, her voice tentative. Richard glanced at her, his expression impassive. "The household requires oversight. You'll be expected to manage the staff, approve budgets, and ensure the property is maintained to standard. It's not difficult." Valerie nodded, her stomach sinking. He had dismissed her hesitation without a second thought, his tone making it clear that refusal wasn't an option. Her days were filled with trivial tasks, such as reviewing menus, approving floral arrangements, and attending events with Richard. He decided where she went, who she spoke to, and how long she stayed. Even her wardrobe became a matter of control. New dresses arrived weekly, each tailored to his preferences. "You should wear this tonight," he said once, holding up a sleek black gown. His voice was calm, but the expectation in his gaze was unmistakable. "I thought I might wear the blue one," Valerie replied, testing the boundaries. Richard's smile was thin. "The black suits you better." Valerie relented, her words swallowed by the heavy air between them. She wore the black dress, just as he'd asked, and the night passed like all the others. Her presence ornamental, her voice muted. The piano in her suite remained untouched. On rare afternoons when she was alone, Valerie would sit at the bench, her fingers hovering over the keys. But the silence of the house pressed down on her, and the music refused to come. She missed the freedom she had once felt when playing, the way the notes had carried her away. Now the piano was just another piece of furniture, elegant and lifeless. Months passed, and Valerie learned to navigate her life under Richard's control. But then, something shifted. Emma arrived. The pregnancy had been difficult, the birth even more so. Valerie spent hours in pain, gripping the hospital bed's cold rails, while Richard paced the room, his impatience thinly veiled. When Emma's cries finally filled the air, Valerie felt something break open inside her. Emma was small and delicate, with a tuft of dark hair and wide, curious eyes. Valerie held her close, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective love she had never known. For the first time, the emptiness she carried felt less suffocating. Emma became her anchor, her solace in an otherwise unyielding life. Richard, however, viewed Emma as another aspect of his carefully constructed world. He made decisions about her care without consulting Valerie, hiring a nanny, and outlining schedules. He politely dismissed Valerie's requests to spend more time alone with her daughter. "You'll have plenty of time with her," he said once, handing Emma off to the nanny. "But there are other priorities." Valerie harbored a simmering frustration. She began sneaking moments with Emma, cradling her in the nursery when the house was quiet or singing lullabies late at night. In those stolen moments, she felt whole again, if only briefly. The breaking point came on a stormy evening. Richard had returned from a business trip, irritable and impatient. Dinner was tense, his clipped responses leaving no room for conversation. When Valerie asked a simple question about his trip, his reaction was swift and cutting. "Must you always pry?" he snapped, slamming his glass onto the table. The sound echoed in the cavernous dining room. Valerie flinched, her breath hitching. "I just—" "Enough," Richard interrupted, his tone sharp and final. Later that night, as Valerie stood in the nursery watching Emma sleep, she felt the weight of his words pressing down on her. Her hands trembled as she reached to stroke Emma's tiny hand. A thought formed in the stillness. This can't continue. The moment came 2 days later. Richard's temper flared again, this time over an innocuous oversight. His voice rose, his gestures sharp and threatening. The look in his eyes sent a chill down her spine. That night, as Valerie sat in her room, the door locked, she knew what she had to do. She needed to depart, not only for Emma but also for herself. The cage she lived in, gilded as it was, had become a danger she could no longer ignore. Valerie turned to the small desk near the window. She began to write a plan, her pen moving with purpose. The house was silent, but her resolve was deafening. The storm arrived on a Thursday evening. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rolled through the sprawling estate like a distant drum beat. Valerie sat at the piano in her suite, her hands resting lightly on the keys. She hadn't played in months, but tonight she needed the escape. The melody that emerged was hesitant, a patchwork of minor chords that seemed to mirror the storm outside. "What is that noise?" Richard's voice pierced the atmosphere with a forceful intensity. He appeared in the doorway, his silhouette stark against the dim light of the hall. Valerie froze, her fingers still on the keys. "It's not noise," she said quietly. "It's music." Richard strode into the room, his movements sharp and deliberate. He loomed over her, his expression dark. "This is what you've been doing with your time, indulging yourself while this household falls apart." Valerie rose, her voice steady, but low. "The household is fine, Richard. I needed a moment for myself." "For yourself?" His laugh was cold, humorless. How selfish. Before she could respond, Richard's hand slammed down onto the piano lid, sending a discordant crash echoing through the room. He gripped the edge of the instrument, his knuckles white, and then, with one furious motion, he shoved it against the wall. The sound of splintering wood and snapping strings filled the room. Valerie gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The piano, the sole item in this house that had evoked a sense of belonging, lay in ruins. "Don't ever waste time on this again," Richard said, his voice low and menacing. He left without another word, the door slamming shut behind him. That night, Valerie sat at her desk, staring at the blank page in front of her. Her mind churned with fear and determination. The shattered piano was the final blow. Richard would not stop until he broke her completely, or worse, Emma. She began her plan with careful precision. First, she listed what she would need: cash, clothes, and Emma's essentials. Next, she sketched out the route to Stonington, Maine, a quiet coastal town she had read about once, far enough to escape Richard's reach. Samantha, a family friend she barely remembered, had retired there years ago. Valerie hoped she would be kind enough to help. In the days that followed, Valerie moved with quiet purpose. She siphoned small amounts of cash from household expenses, just enough to avoid suspicion. She packed Emma's necessities in an old duffel bag and hid it in the back of her closet. Each step was careful, deliberate, and fraught with tension. Every creak of the floorboards, every glance from the staff, felt like an accusation. The night of their escape came quickly. Valerie waited until the house was silent, the soft rhythm of the rain masking her movements. She dressed Emma in warm clothes, bundling her tightly to shield her from the night's chill. "Shh, sweetheart," Valerie whispered as Emma stirred, her tiny fists clenching and unclenching. She held the baby close, her heartbeat quickening as she crept down the back staircase. Outside, the air was thick with the smell of rain-soaked earth. Valerie's breath came in short bursts as she moved through the garden, the wet grass muffling her footsteps. She had arranged for a taxi to wait at the edge of the estate. Its headlights dimmed. As she approached, Emma whimpered softly, Valerie paused, rocking her gently. "It's okay, Emma," she murmured. "We're almost there." The driver helped her load the duffel bag into the trunk, his face expressionless but curious. Valerie slid into the back seat, clutching Emma tightly as the car pulled away. Her hands trembled, her gaze fixed on the receding silhouette of the estate. The journey from Boston to Stonington was long and silent, broken only by Emma's occasional cries and the rhythmic hum of the tires on the wet road. Valerie watched as the city lights faded into darkness, replaced by winding roads and dense forests. By dawn, the oppressive gloom of her old life began to lift, replaced by the soft glow of the seaside town. Stonington was quiet, its charm unassuming. Weathered cottages lined the streets, their shutters painted in cheerful hues of blue and green. Fishing boats bobbed in the harbor, and the scent of salt lingered in the crisp morning air. It was a place untouched by the kind of wealth and power that had suffocated Valerie for so long. As they passed a quaint house with a room for rent sign hanging in the window, Valerie told the driver to stop. Her heart fluttered with nervous anticipation as she approached the door and knocked. It opened to reveal Samantha, a kind-looking woman in her 60s, with soft eyes and a gentle smile. She looked at Valerie, then at Emma, her expression shifting to one of quiet understanding. "You need a place to stay," Samantha said simply. "Yes," Valerie whispered, her voice breaking. Samantha stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. The warmth of the house enveloped them to enter. The warmth of the house enveloped them, and for the first time in years, Valerie felt a flicker of hope. That night, as Valerie lay in the modest room with Emma curled up beside her, she stared at the ceiling and listened to the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. The cage was behind her now, shattered like her piano. For the first time, she could shape her uncertain future. What is your favorite musical instrument? Share it with us in the comments. Music is always a great gift. The morning light seeped through thin cotton curtains, bathing the modest room in a soft golden glow. Valerie opened her eyes to find Emma still asleep beside her, tiny hands curled beneath her chin. The gentle rhythm of her breathing was a balm to Valerie's frayed nerves. Outside, the sound of waves crashing against the rocky shoreline provided a stark contrast to the oppressive silence she had left behind. Valerie slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Emma, and moved to the small window. The view beyond was simple, but striking. A cluster of weathered rooftops, the harbor dotted with fishing boats, and seagulls wheeling against a pale blue sky. Stonington was nothing like the gilded prison she had known. It was quiet, unpretentious, and alive. Samantha, the landlady, greeted Valerie in the kitchen later that morning. She had already brewed a pot of coffee, its rich aroma mingling with the scent of fresh bread. Samantha moved with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime caring for others, her grey hair tied back in a loose bun. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, her voice warm but unintrusive. Valerie nodded, pouring herself a small cup of coffee. "Thank you for everything." Samantha waved a hand dismissively. "No thanks needed. I know what it's like to start over." Her eyes lingered on Valerie for a moment, perceptive but kind. This house has always been a place for people looking for a fresh start. Later, as they sat at the small kitchen table, Samantha shared pieces of her own story. She spoke of her nephew Robert, who she had raised after his parents died in a car accident when he was 10. "He's like a son to me," she said, her voice soft with affection. "Robert travels a lot. He's a violinist, but he visits when he can. This place has always been home to him." Valerie listened intently, finding solace in Samantha's openness. She hadn't engaged in a genuine conversation free from expectations or judgment in years. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of something unfamiliar: safety. Valerie's days in Stonington unfolded slowly, each one a quiet reclamation of her life. Emma's laughter became the soundtrack of her mornings, her giggles ringing out as they explored the small garden behind the house. Valerie marveled at how free her daughter seemed, unburdened by the weight of their past. Valerie decided to venture into town one afternoon. She found a small community bulletin board near the local cafe and pinned a simple advertisement: piano lessons available. Beginners, welcome. She hadn't touched a piano since leaving Richard's house, but the idea of playing again stirred something dormant within her. The response was immediate. By the end of the week, she had 2 students, children from the town, who arrived with shy smiles and curious eyes. Valerie dusted off the upright piano in Samantha's living room, its slightly worn keys a welcome reminder of imperfection. She started each lesson with gentle encouragement, her own passion for music slowly rekindling as she guided her students. Samantha's support was unwavering. She would sit quietly during the lessons, knitting or sipping tea, offering the occasional word of encouragement. "You're talented at this," she said one evening, as Valerie played a soft melody after her students had left. Valerie paused, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. "I forgot how much I missed it," she admitted. Samantha nodded knowingly. "It's a part of you. Don't let it go again." As the weeks turned into months, Valerie and Emma settled into a rhythm. Their days were simple but full, mornings spent at the piano, afternoons walking by the harbor, and evenings sharing meals with Samantha. The town embraced them slowly, the townsfolk offering kind smiles and friendly waves. One evening, as Valerie rocked Emma to sleep, she found herself humming a lullaby she hadn't played in years. The melody came easily now, unforced and natural. She looked down at Emma's peaceful face and felt a quiet sense of achievement. Her mind turned to the future, a future she could mold according to her own desires. The weight of her past was still there, but it no longer defined her. Finally, the horizon appeared open and brimming with possibilities. As Valerie sat by the window that night, the cool sea breeze brushing against her skin, she realized something profound. The life she had dreamed of, the one filled with music, freedom, and love, might finally be within reach. The arrival was unannounced, signaled only by the groan of tires against Samantha's gravel driveway. Valerie looked up from the piano, her fingers pausing mid-scale as the sound of a car door closing echoed through the quiet house. Samantha, sitting with her knitting by the window, glanced out and smiled softly. Samantha set her needles down and rose with practiced ease, saying, "He's home." Valerie followed her to the door, curiosity prickling at the edges of her mind. When the door opened, the man standing there looked both familiar and foreign, like a fragment of someone else's memory. Robert was tall and lean, his dark curls slightly unkempt from the wind. A violin case hung loosely in his hand, its leather worn from use. His expression was calm, but there was a quiet weight in his eyes, the kind born from years of carrying unseen grief. "Aunt Samantha," he said, his voice low and warm, though tinged with fatigue. "Robert," Samantha replied, pulling him into a firm embrace. "It's been too long." He smiled faintly as he stepped inside, his gaze landing on Valerie. She shifted slightly, feeling the weight of his observation. "This is Valerie," Samantha said gently. "She's renting the room upstairs with her little girl, Emma. Valerie, this is my nephew, Robert." "Hello," Valerie said, offering a polite nod. Robert returned the gesture, his movements reserved. "Nice to meet you." The exchange was brief, almost perfunctory, but Valerie noticed the way his gaze lingered on the piano as they moved to the kitchen. He set his violin case down near the door, the gesture deliberate, as though he wasn't ready to part with it completely. Over the next few days, Robert's presence became a quiet undercurrent in the house. He moved with a reserved grace, spending much of his time in his room or out by the harbor. Valerie often heard the soft strains of his violin drifting through the walls at odd hours, melancholic melodies that seemed to mirror the quiet grief he carried. Their interactions were polite, but distant. Robert would nod in passing, offering the occasional faint smile. But there was a barrier between them, one Valerie didn't quite know how to cross. She sensed a shared shyness, a mutual hesitation to intrude on the other's solitude. One afternoon, Samantha encouraged them to sit together in the garden. Emma toddled about, chasing butterflies, while Samantha sipped tea nearby. Valerie and Robert exchanged a few words, mostly about Stonington and its quiet charm. Valerie noticed a flicker of warmth when Emma approached him with a plucked flower, despite his measured responses revealing little. "For you," Emma said, her small hand outstretched. Robert crouched down, accepting the flower with a soft smile. "Thank you, Emma," he said, his voice losing some of its reserve. Valerie watched the interaction, feeling a faint crack in the wall between them. The breakthrough came unexpectedly one evening. Valerie was practicing a simple piece on the piano, her fingers rediscovering the joy of the instrument. The notes flowed softly through the house, filling the spaces between the creak of floorboards and the distant crash of waves. She didn't notice Robert standing in the doorway until his voice broke the air. "That's beautiful," Valerie started, her hands faltering. "I didn't hear you come in." Robert stepped forward, the violin case still in his hand. "May I join you?" he asked, his tone tentative but sincere. She nodded, shifting slightly on the bench to make room. Robert opened the case with practiced care, pulling out the violin and tuning it quickly. The room fell silent as he positioned the bow, and then, without a word, he began to play. The sound was rich and haunting, the violin's voice weaving seamlessly with the piano's melody. Valerie's fingers moved instinctively, matching his tempo, the music between them speaking what words couldn't. It was a spontaneous duet, raw and unpolished, yet profoundly moving. When the final note faded, they sat in silence, the weight of the moment settling around them. Robert turned to her, a small, genuine smile breaking across his face. "You're good," he said simply. Valerie smiled back, feeling an unexpected warmth bloom in her chest. "So are you?" It was a quiet acknowledgement, but it felt like the beginning of something deeper, a shared understanding forged through music. As they packed up for the night, the distance between them felt just a little smaller. That evening, as Valerie lay in bed listening to the faint hum of the sea, she thought of the music they had played together. For the first time, she felt the possibility of connection, of trust. Robert's return had brought something unexpected into her life, something she wasn't sure she was ready for, but something she couldn't ignore. The days that followed their first duet unfolded gently, akin to the gradual unwinding of a tightly coiled thread. Valerie and Robert found themselves drawn together, not through deliberate effort, but through the quiet magnetism of shared solitude and unspoken understanding. Their conversations remained measured, but their silences grew companionable, filled with the ambient hum of Stonington, the rhythmic crash of waves, the faint creak of the house settling, and, more often than not, the soft strains of music. One evening, Valerie sat at the piano, her fingers gliding over the keys as Emma played at her feet with a collection of brightly colored blocks. Robert entered the room, violin in hand, and settled into the chair opposite her without a word. They began to play together again, this time falling into an effortless rhythm. Valerie found herself watching Robert out of the corner of her eye, noticing the subtle tilt of his head as he listened to her melody, the way his bow moved fluidly across the strings. Emma toddled over mid-song, clutching one of her blocks, and placed it carefully on Robert's knee. He paused, glancing down at the child, then back at Valerie, with a faintly bemused expression. "She likes to help," Valerie said, her tone light. Robert smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile, and leaned down to Emma's level. "What's this?" he asked, holding the block up, as if inspecting it. "A house," Emma declared proudly. "Well, it's a fine house," Robert replied, setting the block on the edge of the piano. Emma giggled, clearly pleased with his response, and toddled back to her blocks. Valerie felt a warmth spread through her chest as she watched the interaction. It wasn't just that Robert was kind to Emma. It was the way he seemed to truly see her. Even in the smallest moments, their shared moments extended beyond music. Valerie found herself lingering in the kitchen after breakfast, listening as Robert spoke quietly to Samantha about his latest performances or his plans for the future. He rarely offered much detail, but the cadence of his voice carried a sincerity that drew her in. When he asked about her piano students, she spoke of them with cautious pride, surprised by how easily the words came. Robert and Valerie often found themselves in the sitting room in the evenings, each occupied with their own task. Valerie reviewing sheet music, Robert tuning his violin. The space between them felt neither forced nor distant, but comfortably shared. One night, the conversation turned unexpectedly personal. Robert set his violin aside, his movements deliberate, and leaned back in his chair. "Samantha told me you came here to start over," he said, his tone gentle but curious. Valerie hesitated, her hands stilling over the sheet music. "That's true," she said finally. "Stonington felt like the only place far enough away." He nodded, seeming to understand more than her words conveyed. "I came here for the same reason once," he said, after a pause. "After my parents died, this house. It was the only place that felt safe." The admission hung in the air, unpolished and raw. Valerie met his gaze, finding a quiet grief there that mirrored her own. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "So am I," he replied. But then he smiled faintly, the edges of his grief softening. "Samantha has a way of making this place feel like home, doesn't she?" Valerie nodded. "She does." Emma's attachment to Robert grew with each passing day. She followed him around the house, her small feet padding after his longer strides, and often climbed into his lap with her latest toy or book. Robert, patient and steady, indulged her with gentle humor. One afternoon he even placed a tiny violin in her hands, guiding her fingers over the strings as she squealed with delight. "She's a natural," he joked, glancing at Valerie. "She's determined," Valerie replied, her smile soft. "She gets that from her father." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and the air shifted slightly. Robert didn't press, his gaze thoughtful but unobtrusive. Valerie appreciated his restraint, the way he let her choose when and how much to share. But the peace that surrounded them was not without its undercurrents. Valerie occasionally felt the prickle of unease, an unshakable sense that the life she had left behind was not as far away as it seemed. She noticed the way Samantha's expression tightened whenever Valerie mentioned her past, or how Robert would change the subject subtly but firmly when Richard's name surfaced. Unknown to them, Richard's search continued, his efforts meticulous and relentless. He had hired investigators, sent inquiries to towns across the state, and combed through records with the same precision he used to dismantle competitors. Control was central to his world, and the idea of Valerie escaping his grasp was an insult he could not bear. These shadows lingered on the edges of Valerie's new life, but for now, they remained distant. She focused instead on the notes that filled the house, the warmth of Emma's laughter, and the quiet understanding that was beginning to grow between her and Robert. She felt that it had been a long time since she felt safe and connected, as if the music they shared was slowly bringing the fragments of her fractured world together. Richard's investigation had been methodical. It's been a year. His resources were vast, his persistence unyielding. He followed every thread and pursued every whisper. Weeks of quiet inquiries and discreet surveillance had finally led to this moment. The detective he'd hired handed him a slip of paper, the address written neatly in black ink. "Stonington, Maine," the detective said. "She's there with her daughter." Richard stared at the address for a long moment, the weight of its revelations sinking in. He dismissed the detective with a curt nod, the quiet intensity in his expression betraying none of the storm brewing inside him. That night, he packed a small bag and drove north. The coastal air greeted him sharply as he arrived in Stonington. The town, a quaint harbour community with narrow streets and weathered cottages, stood in stark contrast to the polished urbanity he was familiar with. It felt foreign, untouched by the ambition and control that defined his world. Richard parked his car on a quiet street and approached the address. The modest house, painted a soft blue, boasted an untamed yet vibrant garden. He hesitated at the gate, his hand resting on the cool iron, when a sound drew his attention: laughter. It came from the beach below the house. Richard moved quietly, staying out of sight as he followed the sound. His footsteps slowed as he reached the edge of the dunes. The sight halted him abruptly. Valerie stood barefoot in the sand, her hair loose and tousled by the wind. She held Emma's small hand, guiding her daughter as they moved together in the shallow surf. Emma squealed with delight as the waves lapped at her feet, her laughter clear and bright. Nearby, Robert watched them, a small smile softening his usually serious expression. He held a violin loosely in one hand, the bow tucked under his arm. He played a few light-hearted notes, his music mingling with the crash of the waves and Emma's giggles. Valerie turned to him, her laughter joining Emma's, and for a brief moment, the three of them seemed perfectly in sync, a picture of joy and simplicity. Richard stood frozen, a knot tightening in his chest. The woman he had once tried to control looked nothing like the figure he had dominated. Here, she was radiant, her face unguarded and free, in a way he had never seen. Emma, her spirit so alive, was a reflection of that freedom. He remained there, watching from the shadow of the dunes as the scene unfolded. The ache in his chest grew sharper, the weight of his choices pressing against him. For all his wealth, his power, and his control, he had never given her this ease, this happiness, this life. Richard turned away before they could see him, his footsteps heavy, as he walked back to his car. He sat behind the wheel for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. The image of Valerie's laughter, the sound of Emma's joy, replayed in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt small. In the glove compartment, he found a piece of stationery and a pen. His hand hovered over the paper before he began to write. "Valerie, I failed you. I now realize that I have failed you in numerous ways. Watching you today, I realized I have no right to disrupt the life you've built, the life you deserve. You found what I could never give you, and for that, I am grateful. Please accept this as a gesture of my regret and my hope for your continued happiness." He folded the note and slipped it into an envelope, along with a check. The sum was significant, but it felt hollow compared to the apology he couldn't bring himself to deliver in person. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet streets, Richard placed the envelope in Valerie's mailbox. Richard hesitated momentarily, his hand resting on the mailbox lid, before releasing it. Walking back to his car, he took one last look at the house. The laughter from the beach still echoed faintly in his ears. He climbed into the driver's seat and drove away, leaving behind the town, the house, and the family he had no place in. That evening, when Valerie returned to the house with Emma in her arms and sand still clinging to her feet, she found the envelope. She read the letter in silence, her expression unreadable as her fingers brushed over the neatly folded paper. Robert stepped into the room, his violin tucked under his arm. "Everything okay?" he asked gently. Valerie looked up, a faint smile breaking through her pensive expression. She folded the letter carefully and set it aside. "Yes," she said softly. "Everything's fine." She glanced at Emma, now asleep on the couch, her small face peaceful. For the first time in years, Valerie felt a quiet certainty. The past no longer held her. It had loosened its grip, leaving her free to embrace the life she had fought so hard to create. The house felt lighter the morning after Richard's letter, as if an invisible weight had lifted. Valerie sat by the window, sipping her coffee as sunlight streamed through the glass, painting the modest kitchen in warm hues. Emma's soft babbling came from the living room, where Robert was helping her assemble a puzzle. The laughter that drifted back to her was unguarded, pure. Valerie turned the letter over in her hands, its words etched in her mind. The guilt, fear, and anger of her past had tethered her for so long, but now it felt as though the chains had loosened. She breathed deeply, letting the crisp ocean air fill her lungs, and closed her eyes, finally allowing herself to feel relief. Valerie found herself in the sitting room with Robert that evening, after Emma had gone to bed. The violin lay on his lap, his fingers idly brushing the strings, coaxing soft, aimless notes into the quiet space. Valerie sat at the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys. "Did you read the letter?" Robert asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Valerie nodded, her gaze fixed on the black and white keys. "I did," she said softly. It felt final, like a door closing. Robert set the violin down and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "How do you feel about it?" She hesitated, her fingers pressing a single tentative note. She expressed her relief. "For so long I felt like I was running, like he was always just behind me. But now, I don't know. I feel free." Robert didn't respond immediately, and when Valerie finally looked up, she found his dark eyes studying her, quiet and thoughtful. "You deserve that freedom," he said finally, his voice steady. Valerie smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips. "Thank you, Robert, for being here, for everything." Their eyes met, and for a moment the air between them felt charged, the unspoken words hovering just beyond reach. Valerie's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't look away. "I want to tell you something," Robert said, his voice low, almost hesitant. Valerie nodded, her throat tightening. "I never thought I'd find someone who understood this." He gestured vaguely, his hands encompassing the room, the music, the unspoken grief they both carried. "But then you came here, and suddenly it felt like there was room for something more." Valerie's breath caught, her fingers gripping the edge of the piano bench. "I feel it too," she whispered. Robert's hand reached across the small space between them, his fingers brushing hers. "I want this, us," he said softly. "If you do too." Valerie didn't answer with words. Instead, she turned her hand, letting her fingers intertwine with his. The warmth of his touch was grounding, reassuring, and for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something she had thought lost: hope. In the days that followed, their bond deepened. Robert spent more time at the piano with Valerie, their music becoming a language of its own, one of trust, connection, and love. Emma grew even more attached to Robert, often pulling him into her games or insisting on violin lessons, where she would mimic his bow movements with a toy. One afternoon, as they watched Emma twirl in the garden with a ribbon in her hand, Robert turned to Valerie. "What if we started something here?" he asked, his gaze thoughtful. "Something?" Valerie repeated, tilting her head. "A music school," Robert said, his voice growing more animated. "We have the talent, the space, and the community. Think of what we could give back." Valerie's eyes widened. The idea took root immediately, and she could almost see it. Children filing into Samantha's cozy living room. The air filled with the sound of scales and laughter, the joy of sharing music with others. "That's brilliant," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "We could make it work." Robert grinned. "We can. Together." The word lingered in the air between them, carrying with it a promise. As the weeks turned into months, Valerie and Robert poured their energy into bringing the music school to life. Flyers appeared around Stonington, and soon the small house was buzzing with the chatter of students. Valerie taught piano with Emma, often perched on a stool nearby, watching intently while Robert guided budding violinists with his calm patience. The school became more than just a project. It became a cornerstone of the community. The laughter and music that filled the house brought life to every corner, transforming it into a sanctuary for more than just Valerie and Robert. One evening, as they stood together in the garden, the first stars appearing overhead, Robert slipped his arm around Valerie's shoulders. She leaned into him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "This is the life I never thought I'd have," she said, softly. "It's the life we made," Robert replied. And as Valerie listened to the distant sound of waves mingling with the laughter coming from inside the house, she realized he was right. Together, they had created something beautiful, something built on love, trust, and the freedom to dream again. The music school was thriving. The living room, once a quiet haven, now hummed with life. Students of all ages filled the space, their eager chatter mingling with the sounds of scales and arpeggios. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, each corner of the house alive with music and laughter. Valerie stood by the piano, guiding a young boy through a tricky section of his piece. "Not too fast," she said gently, her fingers demonstrating the notes. "Feel the rhythm first." He nodded, his small hands tentatively following her lead. Across the room, Robert adjusted the bow of a teenage violinist, his voice calm and encouraging. "Relax your wrist," he said. "Let the bow do the work." Emma sat nearby with a toy violin, her face scrunched in determined concentration as she mimicked his instructions. Samantha often watched from her armchair, knitting in hand, and a proud smile on her face. "This house has never been so full," she said one afternoon, her voice carrying a warmth that made Valerie's chest tighten with gratitude. The school quickly became a hub for the community. Parents lingered after lessons, sharing stories over cups of tea, while students practiced together in small groups. Valerie and Robert began organizing recitals, turning their modest garden into a stage where children performed for their families under the twinkling glow of string lights. At one such recital, Valerie played a duet with Robert. She felt the weight of the keys under her fingers, each note resonating with purpose. Beside her, Robert's violin soared, their music weaving together seamlessly. Emma sat in the front row, clapping enthusiastically, her joy infectious. When the final notes faded and the audience erupted into applause, Valerie looked at Robert, her heart swelling. He smiled back, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. This was what they had built. Together, their days were a harmonious blend of work and family life. Mornings often began with picnics by the sea. The three of them sprawled on a blanket as Emma chased seagulls along the shore. Valerie loved these moments, the simplicity of Emma's laughter mingling with the rhythmic crash of the waves. The sitting room's glow illuminated the evenings as music flowed freely. Sometimes Valerie would play while Robert read aloud from a book, his voice a steady undercurrent to her melodies. Other times, Emma would demand family concerts, and they would oblige, their impromptu performances filled with laughter and missed notes. One quiet evening, after the last student had left and the house had settled, Valerie found herself alone at the piano. The lamp's soft glow dimly lit the room, casting long shadows across the walls. Emma was on a nearby stool, plucking at the strings of a ukulele Samantha had given her. Robert appeared in the doorway, his violin in hand. He walked over to the piano and began tuning the instrument, the familiar sound filling the air. Valerie glanced at him, a smile tugging at her lips. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked suddenly. "Miss what?" Robert looked up, curious. "The life you had before this, the travel, the performances." Her voice trailed off as her fingers idly played a soft melody. He considered her question for a moment before shaking his head. "I thought I would," he admitted. "But then I realized something. What we have here, it's the only stage that matters." Valerie felt her throat tighten, his words resonating deeply. She glanced at Emma, who was now humming a tune as she strummed, her tiny face filled with concentration. "This is the life I never thought I'd have," Valerie said softly, echoing her earlier reflection. "And it's ours," Robert replied, his voice steady. Later that night, as the house fell silent, Valerie sat alone at the piano. Her fingers moved across the keys, the melody slow and deliberate. It was a piece she had been composing in her mind for weeks, one that captured the journey she had traveled, a journey from fear to freedom, from loss to love. Emma's soft humming drifted from her room, and Robert's violin rested against the wall, waiting for tomorrow's lessons. Valerie closed her eyes, letting the music fill her. She thought of everything she had left behind and all that she had gained. The chains of her past no longer bound her. Instead, her life was a melody, rich and layered, each note a testament to her resilience and the love she had found. As the final note hung in the air, Valerie smiled, her heart full. She was home. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.